Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Institute for Student Success's Leadership Forum on Post-Affirmative Action and Higher Education. I am Dr. Angela Christie, Director of Educational Programs here at the NISS. We are pleased to see you here today for our inaugural episode and what we hope will be a series of episodes on topics relating to student success leadership. Today's topic has been on the minds of many of our leaders in higher education, and we look forward to playing an active role in shaping a response to the administrative impediments the SCOTUS decision has had on how we ensure equality and student success outcomes. You should see a couple of questions on your screen right now. Please register your answers while I go over some procedurals. Our three speakers today have a long history of working to implement student success initiatives that have a calculable impact on retention, progression, and graduation outcomes. While our discussion will be prompted and facilitated by NISS team members, we encourage you to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen to submit queries that may be elevated to our moderator. Discussions in the chat will not be submitted for consideration during this webinar, but we do have some NIST team members monitoring the chat to help troubleshoot or direct or encourage conversation between campus participants. It's now time for me to turn the floor over to Dr. Jessica Rowland-Williams, Senior Director for Client Engagement Services here at the NISS. Jessica, looks like we have a high percentage of our participants, about 90%, who believe it is the responsibility of leadership at institutions in higher education to create policies and to address some of the inequities based after this post-affirmative action. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you so that you can introduce our other participants and get the conversation started.
Thank you so much, Angela. It's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, Angela, the impact that this decision on affirmative action has on how we ensure equitable outcomes for all of our students is a heavy one. And this is particularly important to me as a Black female who attended an elite institution for graduate school, who may not have been admitted without such policies in place. Sharing space with me today for this conversation are two of my dear colleagues and leaders in student success. First, we have Dr. Timothy Rennick, who is the Executive Director of the National Institute for Student Success, which we affectionately call the NISS, and also Dr. Ryan Maltese, who is the outgoing Director of NISS Operations and Business Development and incoming Associate Vice President for Student Success and Retention at Morgan State University. So happy to be here with both of you all today. So as a bit of an introduction to this conversation, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued the first affirmative action related executive order back in 1965. And in that same year, Johnson gave a historic commencement address at Howard University, where he said, and I quote, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him and bring him to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." And I believe this quote embodies the spirit of what many of the initial affirmative action related policies in higher ed were intended to recognize and atone for, which are the over 300 years of race-based discrimination in college admissions and acceptance policies. Of course, over the years, that narrative behind affirmative action has shifted from accounting for the legacy of discrimination to a focus of ensuring diverse college campuses that would benefit all students. And also over the last 60 years, affirmative action policies have been challenged and questioned and struck down in various forms through many, many court cases and changes in public policy. And the most recent Supreme Court decision, which is why we're here today having this conversation, ends race-conscious admissions policies in colleges and universities nationwide. And while this feels like a very huge blow, and in many ways it is a very huge blow, it's important to note that these policies have been rolled back for many, many years. And 9 states, in fact, have already banned race-based admissions and affirmative action policies for public colleges, and also a number of state systems, including the state system here in Georgia, where we are at the National Institute for Student Success, stopped using affirmative action policies long ago in admissions. One of the states that banned affirmative action policies for college admissions, of course, is California, and that was done in 1996. And Dr. Zach Bleemer, who is a economist who studies college admissions at Yale did a study to look at the impact of the rollback, striking down those policies in California. And what he found was that, one, immediately after those policies were banned, there was an immediate drop in enrollment for racially minoritized students, specifically at highly selective schools, so schools like UCLA and UC Berkeley. He also saw that there were more Black and Hispanic students enrolling in less selective schools. But what was most alarming about his study was that he found that in the long run, that the sizable income gap that already existed between white and Asian college graduates and Black and Hispanic and Native American college graduates in the state of California increased. Zach predicts that, Zach or Dr. Bremen at Yale predicts that the country is going to see a version of what happened in California happening across the nation. And in my opinion, this underscores the urgency for us in this room today to address equity gaps in higher education and continue to design systems that remove barriers for historically underserved students at all colleges and universities. And so with that, I'd like to turn to my panelists and start this conversation by discussing, how do you think, I'll start with you, Dr. Rennick, how do you feel the landscape in higher education has changed in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision about race-conscious admissions? What new challenges and opportunities do you feel have arisen?
Great. Thank you, Jessica and Angela, for the introduction. Great to be with you this afternoon. I do know that the guests we invited to join us today are clients of the NISS, our partner institutions. And what I'd want to lead by saying to all of you is it makes our work more urgent than ever. The reality is affirmative action was never a systemic solution to the problems that were attempting to be addressed. You look at the number of institutions that actually had affirmative action policies prior to the Supreme Court decision, it was under 5% of American institutions, and they tended to be institutions with smaller enrollments. If you look at where the predominant number of Black, Hispanic, minoritized students are, they weren't at institutions that have affirmative action policies even prior to the Supreme Court decision. Just to put this in some kind of perspective, this past spring semester across the entire Ivy League, all institutions that previously had race-conscious admissions, there were about 5,000, in fact, 5,063 to be precise, Black students enrolled. Look at your own campus enrollment. I know at Georgia State this past spring, we had over 18,000 Black students enrolled. So, when we look at affirmative action, I think and the Supreme Court decision, it is a setback in many ways, but it's not a reason for us to change course. That what we are trying to do is create a system of colleges and universities that can better serve all students. What we are trying to do at the NISS is eliminate equity gaps through policies and procedures that impact all students favorably, but have been shown by evidence to disproportionately positively impact our Black students, our Hispanic students, our low-income students, and so forth. And it is those institutions that really need to step forward and make sure that every student has an equal opportunity to graduate. It's those institutions. We're talking about four-year regionals. We're talking about HBCUs, HSIs, MSIs, community colleges. This is the roster of institutions that really need to step it up and say, we currently enroll the vast majority of minoritized students. We need to do a better job. And that's fundamental to the work of the NISS.
So Ryan, you've worked at Georgia State, this institution that served so many Black students, and you're on your way to serve as an associate vice president at an HBCU. What opportunities are you seeing on the horizon?
Yes, thank you, Jessica and Dr. Rennick. Thank you so much for those statements, because you're right. I think this is a time for opportunity. The decision is, as Tim said, it has created some setbacks, but it also poses additional opportunity and challenges for higher education institutions to really look at a couple of things. Number one, what are our admissions criteria? again, the Supreme Court, and you may note, I mean, affirmative action in and of itself based on race has been attacked for more years. It's been under attack for more years than it's actually been, in terms of active. And so, look at what diversity means in terms of bringing in a class of students, kind of across higher education, whatever your institution, and what does that look like? What do you want it to represent? At Georgia State, as racially diverse as we are, our diversity at Georgia State doesn't end there. In my role at Morgan State, as I assume that one, even as an HBCU, there are diversities, for instance, that have to be considered in terms of creating classes that create opportunities for all of our students to learn. And I think for us in higher education, we have to be vigilant as the political narratives continue to shift towards a fairly myopic view of how society should be. We have to continue to be vigilant to teach our students that diversity is important, that inclusivity of ideas as opposed to tolerance of people is what really matters, and really give that charge to our students to be that next generation of leader, and to understand that, the current narrative doesn't have to be their narrative as they go forward. And no Supreme Court decision really should inhibit us from being able to do that and deliver that kind of education to each of our students across community colleges, across the public sector, across private colleges as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ryan. I do believe that part of the reason why we do this work is because we believe in the importance of ensuring that our students are succeeding regardless of their racial or socioeconomic background. However, you also pointed out that this is a very tumultuous landscape. It's very polarized, and there's a lot of confusion around, how you should lead in this particular landscape. So my question for both of you all, who both are in leadership roles, but also talk to a number of presidents and provosts and leaders, is, how do you recommend that leadership strategies evolve in the wake of not only this specific decision, but in this climate where things are so polarized? Dr. Rennett?
Yeah, hopefully this is encouraging in one sense. Jessica alluded to this a little earlier, that in the state of Georgia, which most of you know has historically been a quite red state, we've been banned from using race as part of admissions policies since about 2010. And we have also been banned in other ways. So for instance, we have not been allowed to have any race or ethnicity specific scholarships over this time period either by either Regents, University System of Georgia Regents policy or state policy. And what's interesting about that time period is it's the time of the greatest growth in diversity at Georgia State, in which we've kind of been our most creative in finding ways to first close and then truly eliminate equity gaps based on race, ethnicity, and income level. So I think in some ways this is a moment where leaders can be creative, can recognize that with every constraint there's opportunities to find new ways of addressing what might have been challenges in the past. Georgia State was still a predominantly white institution as of 15 or 20 years ago. We're now one of the most diverse large public universities in the country, with about 78% of our undergraduate students being non-white. And we did that in a context of no affirmative action. And when people ask, okay, well, how did you make that movement without kind of the intentional admissions policies leading the way? The answer is in part by our successes. When we ask why more parents are sending their sons and daughters to Georgia State, the thing we hear the most often is because Georgia State is a place that they think will take care of their child, will be a good place. We hear from parents who have children at other institutions, oh, I wish my institution was providing the kind of personalized attention and day-to-day tracking and intentional outreach and so forth that Georgia State is. So, what we need to do to create that kind of diverse environment that Ryan is talking about, diverse with regard to people, diverse with regard to ideas and so forth, is make sure that students have the personalized supports that they need. And this moment is an opportunity for leaders to step forward and do just that. you may have to change your language a bit, right? We all are used to doing that on a day-to-day basis, right? We don't talk, when our in-laws come to visit, we don't necessarily, communicate at the dinner table the same way we would with just the family. And, when we're talking to our children, we have a different way of messaging points than with our colleagues and friends. And I play that role constantly because I'm moving between, nonprofit circles with one viewpoint and one set of language to speaking in front of our Board of Regents, which are all constituted by political appointees of our governor and so forth. But that's the challenge we need to be willing to welcome. If the mission is one of equity and inclusion in one audience, it can be still the same steps we're taking, but cast in the form of trying to respond to the workforce needs of our communities, trying to provide better economic futures for our students and so forth. When push comes to shove, it's the same thing we're doing on our campuses, right? We're trying to help students succeed and get connected to the right majors and graduate in an efficient way with less debt, and then ultimately land in the careers that are going to lead them to satisfying and hopefully productive lives. That's the same thing, whether we talk about it as all about equity or all about, kind of workforce and so forth. So we're going to have to get more adept at that, more adept at understanding the audience and being able to articulate our goals and our mission in a way that is understandable. But that's just life in general.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And I think it's going to become more and more crucial as our campuses are becoming more and more diverse. And we're seeing that already. We see that at Georgia State. And one of the trickle-down effects that we've seen in states that have already banned affirmative action is that some of the less selective institutions become more diverse. And so it's critical. I loved your point about how we message things, how we talk about things, but how do we prepare for that? How are we starting to prepare for that now, so that when we have a more diverse student population, student body, we're making sure those students aren't falling through the cracks. Now, Ryan, of course, there are other institutions that have been doing this work for years and years and years, right? Mm-hmm. And serving racially marginalized students since their inception. What leadership strategies, how do you see leadership strategies evolving at institutions like HBCUs or HSIs or minority serving institutions that have been doing this work for a long time?
Yeah, that's a really important point, because again, even though some might argue that this particular Supreme Court decision didn't impact those institutions. In a lot of ways it does, because again, these are precursors, right? I mean, we understand what the kind of larger narrative is in terms of being able to service student populations that have been historically underserved. You have to be aware of what your parameters are. And so leadership, to Tim's point earlier, I mean, I think there is going to have to be some creativity, some shifting narratives as you maneuver through, kind of the political landscape, but then also the educational landscape. Creative recruitment is going to be important when we look at it from, how we look at admissions, maybe a phrase of data demography, right? Like, think about it in terms of where are your students coming from, and understanding in those spaces who actually populates those particular spaces, whether you do it by zip code, by region, by area, and thinking about not just who is populating the incoming class or the cohort, but also what voices aren't there. And then how do you strategically seek out to gain those voices? And so there is going to be some creativity, and what narrative may work for one group or one particular region or one community, that narrative, to Tim's point, may have to shift when you go into another community. I think for, all institutions of higher education, but specifically those with a mission to serve Black students or serve Latino students, they have to be vigilant in making sure that even amongst that student populations, that the voices that exist within those populations are heard, and then also be welcoming to other populations that may not fit within that particular mission. Again, for me, higher education has always kind of existed in this pushback kind of framework where, it is for students and for faculty and for administrators to not just readily accept exactly what they are told it's supposed to be, but to question and make sure that what is is what should be. And we've seen that kind of historically, whether it's civil rights movements, whether it's, even the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like, it isn't for higher education to accept the status quo, but to challenge our students to understand what that is. And then if need be, figure out what voices need to be said in order to change it.
And then this is all about practical advice. So let me just offer a couple suggestions, because we have been working under a context in Georgia where affirmative action and race-conscious admissions has not been permissible for better part of 15 years. One is a simple practice that we adopted, which was to take our institutional scholarship recipients and have them give some time back as a recognition of the scholarship. One of the programs that's been most effective, and goes back to the Obama administration because we got a White House citation for it, is having students who receive institutional scholarships go back to their home high schools and spend once every week or once every couple weeks, a couple hours meeting with current students. You might think, well, what does that have to do with affirmative action? Well, if you have a diverse student body and these students are going back to their high schools, what they're doing is increasing the likelihood that students who previously may not have thought of going to college or may have faced hurdles that they couldn't overcome on their own will be able to overcome those hurdles. It's a low-cost program as far as your institutional resources are concerned, but it has a big payoff. When we ran this program in Cobb County schools, and our Cobb County high schools tend to be right now in the metro Atlanta area, an area of considerable growth in Hispanic high school enrollments, we saw about a 20% increase in the number of students going to college. Now, not all of them went to Georgia State because our students weren't going there to recruit to Georgia State. They were going there to meet with the students and their families about what is the FAFSA? How do you think about these processes? When do you have to apply? What is the approach for setting up the finances and so forth? And this can make a big difference, but a disproportionately large benefit to students from underserved backgrounds without in any way being at odds with the Supreme Court decision about race-conscious admissions. Another strategy, one that we're sharing with a number of you as our client institutions, is to work on summer melt. Summer melt, this phenomenon of students who are admitted and confirmed at your institution not making it to the first day of classes, largely because they get held up by bureaucratic obstacles. They don't get the FAFSA done. They don't turn in their verification requests. They have holds on their accounts. They don't put down deposits. They don't get their transcripts. They don't get their immunization records and so forth. Now, what we've done at Georgia State is try to resolve those administrative issues agnostically across our whole student body, so that we're not just solving it for one demographic versus another. We're trying to solve those problems across the board. And as many of you know, we're using chatbot and other platforms to try to identify these problems and reach out to students in a much more personalized and effective way. But the net impact of doing that across the board is to disproportionately benefit students from underserved backgrounds. Right from the very first summer of 2016, when we launched our chatbot, we were able to show that all the students benefited, that all demographic groups benefited, and were making it to the first day of classes at higher rates. But the benefits were strongest for our first generation students, because they were the ones in the past who had the biggest challenges with those kind of bureaucratic obstacles. So none of these things are dedicating resources to a particular population in a way that should be problematic, even in the face of the recent Supreme Court decision. But all of them are strategies that can help your student body not only become more diverse as an institution at the access point, but also succeed at higher levels with these students so that they're graduating at higher rates as well.
And Dr. Rennick, one of the core principles of the NISS has always been making data-informed decisions and leveraging data. How, if at all, does this Supreme Court decision impact the use of disaggregated data specifically in student success efforts?
Yeah, we've had some questions about that in recent weeks about, does this mean we should approach data collection on our campus any differently? Or does this mean that we should rethink who our chief data officer is, or maybe not have our president exposed to as much disaggregated data? Right now, I think the simplest answer is none of these changes are required. There is nothing about the Supreme Court ruling that in any way impacts the collection of data and insights. There's nothing that we've heard from, for instance, federal groups, Department of Education, IPEDS, and so forth, that would suggest that they're changing their strategy in any significant way. IPEDS this year will still collect data that is disaggregated by different racial and ethnic groups in their enrollment reporting and so forth. So this is not a cause to move away from collecting more nuanced data. In fact, I would argue that it's a charge to do it with greater urgency and with greater attention, because what we're going to need to do is really understand how the overall policies we have at our university are disproportionately impacting different demographic groups. The example I gave a moment ago, we didn't have a summer kind of enrollment policy that was separate for different demographic groups. We had one policy, but it wasn't very effective. And when we looked at our data, the students who were not making it through the summer into the first day of fall classes were disproportionately our Pell students, our first generation students, and so forth. So by understanding the disaggregated data, it kind of called our attention to the nature that the problem that the students were facing during the summer before first enrollment. So there are all kinds of diagnostic clues you can get from this data that might be part of a strategy on your campus to reduce equity gaps and to respond, in effect, to some of the challenge that this decision has posed.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Maltese, turning to you for a second. So we know that the University Missouri system announced in the wake of the Supreme Court decision that it was going to end the use of race and ethnicity as a factor in scholarships. My question for you is, does the Supreme Court decision impact scholarships and financial aid for minority students?
Yeah, and that's kind of a broad question. And, I don't know if I'm the authority on what the Supreme Court, whether or not it does. I think it becomes an institutional decision. In the case of the University of Missouri, right, that was a system decision in terms of ending race-based scholarships. To Tim's earlier point, though, I think understanding the Supreme Court decision for what it says will be important for colleges in terms of how they shape their policies. The Supreme Court was very explicit in saying that race can no longer be a factor in considering admissions for students. Supreme Court did not talk about scholarships in terms of, either ongoing or entering and things of that sort. So again, some systems are going to be proactive, some systems are going to be preemptive, things of that sort. But I do think that it presents challenges in terms of how we want to shape scholarships. And again, it doesn't prevent additional lawsuits from being filed, right, that may question the motivation of scholarships. Even then, though, I think to Tim's point about being able to actively use data, and one of the things that Georgia State, I think, has been a kind of trailblazer and leader in higher education on, is understanding your student body and who is in need. Right now, there are huge equity gaps between low-income students and non-Pell students in terms of graduation outcomes. And many of these students are eligible for scholarships, but they either may not know how to get them or just simply aren't informed in terms of what's available to them. And so again, I think universities have to be diligent and proactive in making sure that students have every opportunity to apply for and procure scholarships, whether that be based on race or merit. I think it's important that universities continue to try to provide whatever resources are available that they have to students. And part of that is, getting support both from foundations as well as from alumni to support students across the board, especially those who are historically underserved. And, when we see the stopout rates of students, we're going to see that disproportionately many of those students, if not most, are stopping out for one particular reason: a lack of funds, a lack of financial resources. And so I think the scholarship issue isn't one that we say, oh, well, we need to stop providing race-based scholarships. The larger issue is we need to provide more scholarships to our students, especially our low-income students and historically underserved students, because the data show us that those are the ones who have, who are not progressing at the same rate.
Mm-hmm. And let me say a few more words about kind of the practical approach here, because as I alluded to in my opening comments, Georgia State has also, for the period of us moving the needle on our graduation rates, been under a mandate in the state of Georgia that we could not have race or ethnicity-based scholarship programs. But as Ryan is suggesting, that doesn't mean that you can't do things that help move the needle to closing equity gaps. And so a couple examples here. What Ryan was alluding to a moment ago was our Panther Retention Grant Program. Our Panther Retention Grant Program is blind to race and ethnicity. We do not consider it or weigh it in any way in the recipients. What we're looking at are students who are close to graduating, who are running out of eligibility for their other aid programs. We found in our data, there are a lot of students who are good risks for completing their degrees who were running out of their Pell Grants, their institutional aid, their loans before they completed their degree. So we give the grants to those students. We've now given, over the course of a 10-year period, over 19,000 of these grants out. Again, blind to race. But it turns out when you give $19,000 grants out to students blind to race over a 10-year period and focus on the students who are running out of eligibility for their aid before they graduate, running out of resources, you give the money disproportionately to students who are from minoritized backgrounds and from low-income backgrounds. And that's been the net impact of this program. So even if, as some people suspect, that there will be legal challenges that may extend this Supreme Court ruling eventually to the awarding of scholarships, there are effective ways of still serving students and closing equity gaps with your institutional aid. A second example of this is we had a large and valued donor in the Atlanta area who wanted to support scholarships for Hispanic students. And we first had to explain, no, we can't do it quite that way. They wanted us basically to identify students who were Hispanic and allow them to apply and exclude others. And that was a non-starter from a legal perspective, given the rules and policies we're under in the state of Georgia. But what we were able to do, consistent with state law and policy, is create a program that is eligible to students who show a commitment to the Hispanic community, that show an appreciation of the issues facing the Hispanic community and that commitment to trying to resolve them. And so part of the selection process was an essay where students had to show that kind of commitment and that kind of affinity. Over the course of 6 or 7 years running this program, I can tell you from experience, most of the students who got the scholarship were in fact Hispanic, but not all of them. There were a few students over the years who did not self-identify as Hispanic who got the scholarships. And, you know, you might say that's a compromise. In some ways, if it's a compromise, it's a very small one, because I think even the selection committee said, if you can show this deep commitment to the issues facing the Hispanic community and an effort to reduce these challenges and so forth, even if you're not a member of the Hispanic community, yeah, you should be eligible for this award. So again, I think we've got to realize, one, as Ryan indicated, there's nothing in the current decision that explicitly excludes you from having race-conscious scholarship programs. But if that were to come, it has already come in a number of states, and there are still ways of productively working in that environment, in that context.
Now, speaking about scholarships, one thing we know is that a lot of those scholarships are funded by foundations and private donors and such, as you already alluded to. One of the things that we've heard is that a lot of institutional leaders are experiencing whiplash in the sense that, 2020, we were talking about George Floyd, everybody had equity statements, diversity statements, that's where all the funding was going. And a lot of campuses put a lot of time and attention and resources towards standing those things up. And now we're in a space where, in some states, you can't even say those words or say those things. And so what advice do you have for leaders, and this is for both of you all, around how you can best represent your campus's work, especially to external stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, and I'll start with kind of a personal story that kind of came out of the NISS. One of our graduate assistants who recently finished up her dissertation was doing research on this notion of manufacturing ignorance, and I remember watching her in her defense, and what she really talked about was how policies can somehow create a knowledge gap in terms of what young people should know, and really looking at the notion of, what is woke culture and what is kind of the backlash around, some of these buzzwords that you alluded to in DEIJ efforts, Jessica. And I think, as I think about that and I think about what higher education can do, and I think where both the NISS has been successful, but other institutions as well, is understanding what your story is and being able to show your story, both in a data-driven method, but then in a qualitative manner that kind of brightens that particular data. To say we are committed to educating educating the next generation of leadership. Here's how we've done it. Here's what we are committed to and what we will continue to be. One of the things that I think we have to be very, very careful on is to allow any one Supreme Court decision or policy to kind of take us as higher education practitioners and institutions away from what our core mission is. And crafting our narrative and our story around what that core mission is in education, in equity, in opportunity, and access. I think that is what resonates with funders. That is what resonates with stakeholders, and being committed and resolute in that mission. Now, I know that's kind of, broad in its statement, but, having seen kind of the evolution, both of this organization, but then having spent, more than 20 years in higher education, understanding what that mission is, especially of educating those from historically underserved and sometimes othered backgrounds, I think is quintessential in order to gain the support that you need and really for sustainability.
And I'll say that a few weeks ago, I had the honor, opportunity, experience of testifying in front of the House. And a couple of years ago, I testified in front of the Senate. In both cases, they invited me to talk about kind of our approaches to using data and so forth to help students graduate. What is interesting about those invitations is both of them, the Senate and the more recent House invitation, came from the Republican side of the aisle. Now, given the profile of Georgia State and given kind of the message we have about equity, that might seem surprising. But what I want to emphasize as far as addressing your stakeholders is part of the way to address your stakeholders across the board is for us to do a better job in our mission, right? When we have low graduation rates and we have gaping equity gaps and we have students graduating with huge amounts of debt and so forth, it's hard to make a good argument for whatever end of the political spectrum the stakeholder is at, whether you're talking to a nonprofit or whether you're talking about to a politician in your state. It's a hard hill to climb. That if you can show that you're delivering on your mission, that you're graduating the students who come to you at high rates, that they're graduating efficiently, that you're preparing them to go off into the careers and into life and be successful and happy individuals, then there are a host of arguments that you can compellingly make to just about any stakeholder who's out there. I won't say any because we know we live in very divisive times and there's no point that will please everybody. But our current chancellor is the former governor of Georgia, who was also one of President Trump's cabinet members. And he loves what we're doing, in part because we've been graduating with 3,500 more students than we were a decade ago. We're graduating them more efficiently. One of the metrics that is less talked about as far as Georgia State is concerned is our average debt load at graduation for our bachelor students has gone down every single year since 2016. And we're now about half the level of the state of Georgia overall for the debt load that our students bear when they graduate. Well, that didn't just happen by accident. That happened because we're reaching out to the students proactively and making sure they're in the right classes. And if they're going off path, we're getting them help so they don't withdraw or get a D. They get a passing grade in the course, and we're helping them, pick their majors in the first year so that they're not bouncing around and so forth. Those programs that are the very essence of what Georgia State is doing to produce more equitable outcomes that have greatly increased our graduation rates for our Black students, our Hispanic students, our Pell students, and so forth, are also the arguments that, Chancellor Perdue and his group are looking for achieving in greater numbers across the state of Georgia. So, a lot of what the NISS shares with you as colleague campuses is us taking responsibility and recognizing we're part of the problem. But if we can be part of the solution, if we can show that because we are doing things differently, our students are excelling, they're graduating with less debt and at higher rates and so forth, I think you've got a pretty compelling argument to just about any stakeholder that you're facing.
I mean, I feel like that's such a poignant point. You know, we've been part of the problem. How can we be part of the solution? So I think with that, we want to create some space and time to answer any questions. So if you have any questions, please put those in the chat. We'll give folks a few minutes to put some questions in the chat if you have any. And if you don't have any questions but want to share maybe what's happening on your campus or some of the concerns that are coming up for you, we'd love to hear about that too.
Yeah, I'm intrigued, for instance, about the fact that during the opening survey question, the vast majority of you indicated that your campuses currently do have race and ethnicity-based scholarship programs. So curious about what you're thinking in your state. One of our partners is in the state of Missouri, whereas Ryan mentioned earlier, the Attorney General, within a couple days after the Supreme Court ruling, said that in Missouri there weren't going to be any more race and ethnicity-based scholarships. I mean, I'm interested in how you may be dealing with those conversations on your campus and whether there are any actions that are taken, or is it a wait-and-see attitude at present?
And if you do want to share, just go ahead and raise your hand because I can change the settings and allow you to talk in the webinar. So if you're interested in sharing but not typing, please just raise your hand. Okay, so I have a question from one of our guests, and it is Michigan Bar's funding designated to any one demographic group. How do you increase a sense of belonging with equity among your student populations?
And Jessica, you can also respond because you've had lots of experience in this space, but you want to take a first stab at that one?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think that those are two separate questions, right? I think that, you know, funding students and providing funding for specific groups based on race and creating a sense of belonging are kind of two unique paths to think through. I think sense of belonging, you know, starts with a lot of things like, you know, how students are oriented to campus, right? How they're welcomed. Sense of belonging can, you know, be based on what's taught in certain classes and whether they feel like they're, you know, represented in course materials. Sense of belonging can, you know, be created by things as simple as, you know, professors learning their students' names and having to pronounce them correctly, you know. And so I think that there are a number of ways that you can create a sense of belonging on a campus that have nothing to do with funding, but have more so to do with intentional training and creating systems that really do focus on creating space for students. And so I think that's what I'll start the conversation with.
Yeah, and I'll say that, you know, one of the things that has happened, Georgia State does a lot of these things at scale because we're over 50,000 students. And, you know, so we're trying to find systematic ways of personalizing the experience. But we've seen some really positive indicators. Our graduating seniors take surveys as they leave us, and we ask them questions about, did they feel like the university cared about them and supported them and so forth? And we've seen significant positive movement in those answers in recent years. Some of our programs specifically have been cited by students. One that comes to mind, I've mentioned already this afternoon, is the Panther Retention Grant Program. You know, this is a data-based program that gives awards to students close to graduating in most cases who have run out of aid without them having to apply for it. And I'll tell you that it's not the traditional way we think about a sense of belonging. It's not kind of a personal interaction. It's not really looking at the student's demographic or cultural background and so forth. But the students have commented how much it makes them feel like somebody cares about them, that somebody was watching enough to know that they had run out of money, and even though they didn't apply for the money, they got this award delivered directly to them. We've seen some of that with our chatbot as well. We had a Wall Street Journal article done about our use of technology last fall, and they wanted to speak to some students who had used the chatbot. And they spoke to one woman. Ultimately, they decided to anonymize her in the article for obvious reasons, or reasons that will become obvious. You know, she was in I remember, chemistry or political science course and really struggling. And she chatted into the text platform, I need help in this course because I'm losing the will to live, LOL. Well, we've programmed into our chatbot some trigger words. So if the student talks about harming themselves, harming others, losing the will to live, and so forth, these words and phrases will immediately escalate that text to somebody live who is ready to receive the message personally. And we did that in this instance. It was flagged, the comment, and we reached out to the student, and by her own admission, she wasn't laughing out loud about it. She was in a very difficult position, and we were able to connect her with the counseling center. So none of these are the traditional definition of how you create a sense of belonging, but that's part of what we need to be doing as a sector, is thinking more creatively, especially with a generation of students who grew up on iPhones and tablets and so forth, to recognize the way they receive a sense of belonging may be quite different than what we've been familiar with in the past.
Yeah, I think that's well said on both accounts. I mean, sense of belonging should not be funding driven, right? Like that should be done with an intentionality, from the higher education institution to basically say, okay, what are the spaces that our students need in order to be able to find themselves and ultimately find their tribe, right? I mean, like it's not you're going to throw money at something and think that that's going to solve a particular issue, but more, more intentional, whether it's creating safe zones in certain offices, whether it's recognizing, affinity groups kind of across the board. It's not a race-based kind of philosophy, but much more, understanding who your students are, and to Tim's point, what that particular generation of student needs in order to facilitate that transition from whatever space they occupied before they got to the campus to the campus itself. And so I think, and Jessica, I think you made the point that, it might have been somewhat conflated, but yes, I think that institutions of higher education, whether it's community colleges or four-year colleges, must be intentional in creating, kind of multiple spaces for students to be able to see themselves, whether that's through staff, whether that's through, fellow students, student organizations, however that is, but really try and find themselves and know that they are in a space that cares about them, embraces them, and ultimately is interested in both their college completion, but also their career and their life skills attainments.
So we've got a couple other questions in the chat I want to get to. So one is that the University of South Carolina just changed the title of their Chief Diversity Officer position.
Sorry,
this
Jessica,
was criticized.
We couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay. I'll start over. So we have a couple questions.
You're coming through fine. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, the University of South Carolina just changed the title of their Chief Diversity Officer position. This was criticized as a change in mission, but is this reframing the kind of approach that will allow this work to continue in red states? So I think, that alludes, Dr. Rennick, to your point about, changing language, sort of recasting the way we're thinking about things, although we may just be repackaging, some of the existing things that we're already doing.
Yeah, and I hate to, make that a sweeping policy that we yield in the face of any type of resistance, because I think there are some things that are really critical to our mission we need to defend. But if we can defend those things by changing the title on a HR form of an individual, but they still can substantively do the work that needs to be done, then that's probably a concession that's worth making, especially if the alternative is losing that functionality and that staff position entirely. We're facing some similar conversations in the state of Georgia right now. We've had audits done any program or position that uses certain terms and so forth. But it is kind of parallel to the pivot we've been talking about with regard to how you might award scholarships or how you might, be more effective at recruiting from certain high schools in your area and so forth. It's finding creative ways to get the work done. And, ultimately we're all about the students, and it doesn't make any sense to take, die on a hill where we're losing, we're making a statement, but losing a position that then will end up hurting our students in the long run.
Yeah.
And Tim, to your point on that, I think that voice is also going to be important. Like I just remember reading something this morning, with down in Florida, a couple of colleges basically got rid of the entire DEI office. And so as students were onboarded this week, I mean, I think it was an article today in the USA Today talking about the fact that the students were the ones who were up in arms about that. The fact that, this conversation was not even being allowed to be had. And I think sometimes we, forget that student voice is oftentimes more powerful than ours. Going back to February 1st, 1960, where, 4 freshmen at North Carolina A&T sat down at the Woolworth's lunch counter because, they felt like, hey, if I can shop here, why can't I order a cup of coffee here? And we know that ultimately resulted in, sit-in movements kind of across the South. So I think it is also important to be able to allow space and encourage the student voice, especially at times when we as administrators are kind of hamstrung to do maybe what we want to do or maybe what we think is the right thing to do, and allow that student voice to take hold and find its own kind of power in how it can kind of change society.
Yeah. We've got one more question I want to get in before we end here. And that question is: the culture in which I work favors merit-based scholarships rather than need-based. Is there a best practice ratio for merit versus need-based scholarship funding?
I don't think there's any magic formula. We've had a lot of experience and we've run grants, and Jessica can speak about this as well because she helped run a program across 11 mostly flagship public universities for a need-based aid program. What we found there and what we've seen at Georgia State is, and the NISS, is that the needs differ greatly by context, right? In Georgia, Georgia is a state that has a very large merit-based scholarship program. Even a little bit of need-based aid makes a big difference because there's so little of it currently available. We work with some states, I think California was one of them, where the relatively modest amount of need-based aid in the program, the microgrant program, maybe didn't have the same sort of impact and so forth. So I think it differs by context, but I will say this, that if you can find a way to begin to build up even an institutional aid program for need-based aid, what we have found is those programs will pay for themselves. That we know the most kind of surprising finding from our use of these microgrants over a 10-year period, and this was by Boston Consulting Group that came in and did the study, is that when we give money to students, we actually end up with more institutional revenue from it, because these are mostly students who are walking away never to contribute to tuition and fees to Georgia State again. And by keeping them enrolled and keeping that momentum going, even for one additional semester, let alone in some cases 2 or 3 additional semesters, that ends up more than covering the cost of the programs. So it's another way where we're short-sighted, especially in times of budget cut, we think, oh, we've got to end this and stop this and so forth. But some of these programs really are not just investments in our students, they're investments in the fiscal health of our institutions.
Ryan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was well said. I 100% agree.
All right. Well, as we move to close, any closing thoughts from either of you? I have some, but I'll finish last.
I'll just say that in essence, it wasn't designed this way, but the work that you're doing with the NISS is well shaped for the time we live in, because what Georgia State has found over the last decade is the best way to close equity gaps is solve large systemic issues that impact all of our students, not only every semester, but in some cases every day. And nothing that the NISS has put forward for your campuses will be, in my estimation, in violation of any of these policies coming down from the Supreme Court or from our state systems.
Agreed. And I think, probably, and Tim, I think you mentioned this in the statement you put out earlier, but I think probably now more than ever, the need is so great for us as higher education practitioners to be astute, to understand how to usher in education opportunity, understanding what equity means for this next generation of learner, and making sure that we provide every opportunity for them to succeed, removing those barriers, the quintessential mission of the NISS in terms of making sure that students have every opportunity to move forward and progress. And so thank you to our clients who are partners in that work and are working with us and committed to that mission of educating students in this kind of new age and narrative.
And so I'll just conclude by underscoring what both of them have said and just saying, now is the time to stay the course. You came to us because you wanted to close equity gaps. You came to us because you cared about ensuring equitable outcomes for your students. And now is the time to keep moving forward with that mission, with that charge. We certainly appreciate working with you and appreciate partnering with you on this journey. Angela, back to you.
Thank you. So our time has come to an end. I would like to take a moment to thank our speakers, Drs. Jessica Rowan-Williams, Timothy Rennick, and Ryan Maltese, and to thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to participate in this very important conversation. As you log off, you should receive a prompt for a quick survey. We look forward to receiving your feedback on this leadership forum, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.